the Party of Socialism and Liberation, and I was a volunteer for Gloria La Riva's 2020 presidential campaign here in San Diego. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to ask everybody watching on Facebook to please hit those like and share buttons so we can spread this message as far as possible. A big thank you to those who have already have. Tonight, we have two great speakers and dedicated community organizers, followed by an open discussion period. Before I introduce them, I'd like to give some background as to what the Answer Coalition and what the Answer Coalition is and why we decided to put on this monthly forum series. Answer, aka the Act Now and to Stop War and End Racism Coalition, was founded 3 days after the 9/11 attacks in anticipation of escalated US warmongering, Islamophobia, and anti-Arab racism. Answer is the organization that initiated the massive anti-war movement opposing the US invasion of Iraq, leading up to March of 2003. Tens of millions of people from around the world participated in this movement in response to what has become endless war in the Middle East and Africa. Though that movement ebbed and the people's struggle has not yet overcome the devastation of US imperialism, dedicated activists and organizers have taken the streets throughout the years following, including demonstrations in response to the ongoing occupations of Afghanistan, Korea, genocide against Yemen, the assaults on Iraq, Libya, Syria, drone strikes in Pakistan and Somalia, and in opposition to blockades against Venezuela, Palestine, and Cuba, to name some important causes. Today, both the Democratic and Republican parties endorse what they call a pivot to Asia and great power conflict with China and Russia. We in the Answer Coalition believe that what has been described even by mainstream media as a new Cold War will have devastating consequences for the working class and oppressed people in both the US and around the world. We have already seen a rise in anti-Asian hate crimes in large part due to xenophobic and generally one-sided attacks against China in both liberal and conservative media. It also has consequences for socialists, Black liberation organizations, and independent journalists who have been falsely accused of being Russian bots or Chinese Communist Party agents. We also believe that since only a people's movement against racism and war can defeat this bipartisan attack against our brothers and sisters around the world, that we have a duty to fight and a duty to win. That is why we must not only discuss these issues, but act on them. These forums are designed not only to keep us informed as a community, but to serve as a call to action to join an anti-war, anti-racist, or socialist organization so we can unite against imperialism and achieve liberation for all. Pardon the puppy in the back, guys. Tonight, our conversations will mostly revolve around police abolition, what it means, why police under capitalism only serve to oppress us, and what abolition could actually look like. Our first speaker will help us frame policing and abolition struggles in a historical perspective. So with that, I'd like to introduce them. Arantxa Calles is a longtime organizer with the Answer Coalition. They have contributed to video productions for a variety of local and nationwide struggles, including the Freedom Them All Coalition, the La Riva 2020 presidential campaign, and a mini documentary entitled Federal Relief for Lake Charles, about the people of Lake Charles, Louisiana, who were devastated not only by Hurricane Laura, but also government neglect in the months following and to this day. Arantxa is a frequent contributor to liberationnews.org, and they have been on the ground throughout the nationwide struggle against racist police terror, in that large part was initiated following the murders of George Floyd. They also organized for full rights for all immigrants and the abolition of ICE and the Department of Homeland Security. So please give a warm welcome to Arantxa.
There we go. Hello, everybody. Hello from the world of the internet. Today, we are going to have conversations on police abolition, and a crucial part about talking about police abolition in the current context is having this conversation and knowledge of the history of abolition. And unfortunately, chattel slavery, the history of that in the U.S. is not really told either at all, or it's told really unfaithfully. Which really prevents us from having a clear plan for abolition today. We should be able to have a clear understanding of how things happened in the past, and yet this is made, hidden for very deliberate reasons. And so part of our mission is to organize and agitate and find a way out, of course, but also to look at the past and try to seek out the true history of resistance during this time. Because in U.S. history, the aspect of rebellion and struggle in all the history books and certainly public education is, the rebellion of enslaved people is really minimized. It's sort of seen as something that happens sporadically every so often. We know of a few people, but we don't really know about the fact that this was a constant force and a big reason why slavery was able to be abolished partially in the time that it was. And most of the focus is put on bourgeois abolitionists who aren't really as revolutionary, who had more sentimental or maybe religious considerations that weren't necessarily tied to very revolutionary action. And the resistance out of solidarity by white working class people is not really given any attention at all, which also is a really crucial part of why you don't see slavery the way that we used to. Certainly it's still around in certain parts of our system today, but not in quite the same scope. And the reason that this is all hidden and made difficult to find is deliberate. The ruling class is really afraid of the power of oppressed people when we band together and work together for an equitable society. And if I was a capitalist, I think I'd be pretty scared too. So makes sense. In Capital, Marx said that labor in white skin can never be free as long as labor in black skin is branded. And so what does this mean? So Capital is trying to explain the structure of capitalism as an economic system and the socio-political economic ramifications of that. And it is a system that thrives off of exploitation of people, so working class people. And working class people of all origins have a direct stake in ending slavery because it, upholds that exploitative system. And that's, for the sake of good overall of mankind, of course, but slavery also had a direct link to the exploitation of working class in the North. So there is a direct motivation and reasoning for them to also try and abolish slavery. And so the beginning of this history of resistance begins in 1619, which is the date that the first African enslaved stolen people from Africa were brought to be exploited in Jamestown, Virginia, after being, stolen and forced to sail there on slave ships. You must consider that not just, the process of finally being here and being forced to work was incredibly brutal, but also the journey was often incredibly, brutal. Many people died, and that, it was a very sad part of history. And so as soon as people were forced to be here, rebellion started, and they kept going. They were really consistent. They had rebellions, they had escapes, they had sabotages, and they had other forms of resistance. I read a book called Closer to Freedom, Enslaved Women and Everyday Resistance in the Plantation South. And it talks about the ways that even though, the bigger, more public-facing rebellions and escapes and things that we hear about were a big part of the rebellion, there's also a big part where women would play a big role in helping people who were absentee, who would leave plantations for a period of time and help house them and help hide them, give them food, and offer them protection, and how that was a really dangerous part of their resistance. And that isn't really ever talked about, the role of sort of everyday resistance of women who were enslaved. And so there was also all sorts of rebellions and a resistance that isn't even talked about in popular U.S. history. And, sometimes they mention a few, but, there were much more than could be summarized in just one list. So I'm just going to talk about a few examples. So, two of some of the most known examples would be the Nat Turner's Revolt, which was in 1831. I remember learning about that in school. And it's mischaracterized as being completely anti-white. Like it was just an anti-white protest, but Turner spared the homes of working class white families. It wasn't just like anti-white, it was anti-slave owner and the normal way. And according to a paper from the time, it said that Turner thought that the poor white inhabitants didn't think of themselves as better than the slaves, and so didn't have a reason to kill them. But they did kill 55 slave owners and their families, which, after you consider just how many Black families were tortured to death during this time, seems like a pretty clear case of self-defense. So I also know Nat Turner is often characterized as just being like a murderous, crazy person, which comes up again, unsurprisingly. But he was really the leader of a very brave rebellion. North Carolina killed 56 Black people in relation to this rebellion, and racist militias killed 200 more, whether they were involved or not, just racist killings with no other motive. And today we certainly see, racist militias killing people for just racist motives with no other motivation is still certainly around. Another person we hear about is Harriet Tubman, rightfully so. Another famous figure who was a nurse, a spy, a Union spy, and a suffrage supporter. She was head of the espionage and scout network for the Union and helped free, one could say, up to 1,000 people, and that's both counting the Underground Railroad and the Combahee Ferry raid, So very important and good that we learned about them, but that's almost all that we really hear about resistance and rebellion. It's not really delved into too much. So the true history of abolition is still yet to be sort of discovered and talked about openly. And its true spirit is really rebranded, missing like its revolutionary soul. Like for one example, the Jayhawkers in Kansas, they are not just a mascot for like an athletic team. They were historically a group of unofficial abolitionists who were really radical and who fought a border war with slave owners in one instance, and their hired thugs. They conducted raids also into Missouri to stop the attempts of pro-slavery forces to turn Kansas into a slave state. They were, really super radical and militant and active in their attempts to stop slavery. And that's, an example of white working class solidarity. And one of these Jayhawkers was John Brown, who some may have heard of, I'm guessing, in this room. A few of you have. But his raid on Harper's Ferry was really important. And it was characterized as him, again, being this sort of like murderous, crazy character. But in fact, he just saw the brutality of slavery for what it really was and wanted to stop it. It seems pretty reasonable to me. And he was also a Jayhawker and a working class white man. So Brown and others killed 5 pro-slavery thugs, and he was involved in other, raids to the effect of helping fight slavery. And he very famously said on the gallows that if he had acted this way for the rich and the powerful, that they would have rewarded him instead of punishing him. And powerful words, and a dedicated revolutionary to the very end. So I think John Brown is quite a hero. And another example of this working class solidarity would be with just the sheer number of the Northern trade unions who were involved in the Civil War, and that the effect that Northern trade unions basically ceased to exist because everyone was fighting on the Union side. Irish immigrants escaping famine, German workers from Prussian revolutions, and refugees from other failed revolutions in 1848 contributed their fighting spirit and resolve for the greater good, understanding, the effects of oppression and poverty and exploitative conditions. But 186,000 Black soldiers volunteered, mostly freedmen, to fight, which outnumbered all other groups, showing, a great amount of bravery and resolve and desire to end such an exploitative system. And another example of working class solidarity comes from a man named Newton Knish, who organized several hundred anti-Confederate guerrillas. He was a poor white farmer and, declared Jones County in the Confederate area to be a free state, seceded from the Confederacy. And we really only even know about this because he spent the years following the Civil War hidden until he could tell journalists about it. And even then, I hadn't heard about it until I researched this. So that's quite a shame. But lots of brave instances of rebellion that we definitely don't hear about. And all of this struggle, led to consciousness raising, especially one of the things that I read about was the involvement of people in, the Civil War. And, at the time it was framed as like these freed Black enslaved folks who would become workers were going to take away the jobs and weaken the power of labor, much like how we hear, the racist myths today, like with Trump and other American politicians overall. But really, it strengthens labor, and it always strengthens labor to do with slavery. And so it actually, helps. And that was a total lie, unsurprisingly. And this consciousness raising in Union soldiers happened because they really just saw how horrible people were treated, especially, Black enslaved people, but also poor white people in the South were also just incredibly oppressed and treated really horribly. And this grew abolitionism. And there was one instance where Confederate soldiers arrogantly entered the Union camp and demanded their slaves back. And it said, the bravery of the Black soldiers who stood up to them and fought back, and the solidarity that white soldiers were then able to display in that moment helped raise abolitionism as well, and the popularity of being an abolitionist. And another very interesting aspect of abolitionist history that we don't hear about was an aspect of pirate history. Apparently, Blackbeard's Queen Anne and Queen Anne's Revenge and Bellamy's Whydah, the two slave ships, were stolen slaver ships, which I certainly didn't know about at all whatsoever. And once those ships were captured and the slavers were done away with, the people who had been stolen and enslaved on the ship were offered the same conditions as any other pirate on the ship, offered, the chance to work there and have that, be their life away from slavery. So I thought that was quite interesting. I didn't know that at all. So another instance of working class solidarity would be with the International Workmen's Association. That was the first international who tried to continue the struggle with a march of 20,000 people in September 1871. The slogan was "Working men of all countries unite." And Black members of the Waiters Union and the Plasterers Union were applauded when they joined this march, which, if you contrast it with 8 years earlier when anti-draft riots brutalized Black communities, there was a great surge of consciousness raising because of people's, constant involvement and growing involvement and struggle. Showing us that, the more, and we're seeing that today, the more people are involved, the more the consciousness is raised, which Farah's going to talk about. And why was it hidden? Because where are there all, and there's more, like where are all these aspects hidden from history? And it really, movements look to the past for inspiration, they should. And if one sees the true nature of the history of like solidarity actually pushing forward the movement towards abolition and towards a more equitable society, then, capitalists are bound to lose, which they are. So it makes sense that they would try to obfuscate that history and make us think that, no, it's all rugged individualism and it's all everyone's alone, and no, you have no effect on your society, and no, these rebellions don't work, and no, organizing does nothing, and just stay home and be sad and be hopeless. When in reality, solidarity, and workers need solidarity, is really the way out. And the reason why all of these things are upheld, like the horrible racism and police brutality, is because, there's an economic system that enforces them, and working class people just need to band together, have solidarity, and, organize for a better future. So we should prioritize a working class focus of history, especially of abolitionism. And thank you for listening to me. I will now hand it over to the lovely Farah so that they can talk about a more current content.
Is it? Am I going? Am I? All right. So, thank you for the presentation, comrade. now we'll open up for a few questions or comments. We will have a longer discussion period after the next speaker. Please use the raise hand feature on your question in the chat. So if anybody has a question, just go to participants. You should see like everybody who's here, and then there will be the little raise hand thing on the bottom left if you're using a phone or whatever device you're using, and you should be able to just raise your hand and we will call on you. Any questions? Well, so I actually have a question. I do have a question since no one's on. So comrade, my question would be, well, overall, like how did you do some of the research for a lot of these topics on abolition? Because I know, at least for myself, throughout high school and like even middle school, elementary, they really soften a lot of the struggles going on in the US when it comes to abolition, whether it's from slavery or LGBTQ plus rights or any other struggle going on within the United States. So what were some of the resources you used in compiling your little speech tonight?
Yeah, well, that's a wonderful question. It is really hard sometimes to find these sources. You'd think that you could just trust a educational system to teach you how things actually happened and worked, but unfortunately, that's not the case in this country. So a lot of what I used was a wonderful article, which I will link, from Liberation News, which was about the true history of abolition. And they used many wonderful historical sources to source all of their information, which I would recommend go down. You can see all the sources, and that had a lot of very interesting reading on a history that's really hidden. I also was lucky enough to go to college, and I took a history of slavery course, and that's where I found and talked about this book by M.H. Camp about enslaved women and everyday resistance in the plantation South. And a lot of the ways that this is compiled is people that just knew that there was there was more to history than was being told to them in school, and really digging through and finding these wonderful sources of testimonials from people in different ways and family histories in order to help talk about. And thankfully, we're in a time where consciousness raising is happening and people are feeling able to actually delve deeper into these issues and talk about them. And part of what makes me happy to be here talking to all of you.
Awesome. Thanks for the answer, comrade. I definitely have to check some of those sources out from Liberation News. So before we continue, are there any questions in the audience right now? Don't be afraid. Shoot your shot.
We have someone in the chat asking if we can put the sources in the chat. And yes, we can. We will post the links in just a moment. Thank you so much for asking. And we will have another question and answer session at the end. Coleman has their hand up. And Coleman, you are unmuted.
Thank you. And thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, Ranza. I really enjoyed it. There are so many fascinating stories in this time about people working together in really surprising ways. I was wondering if you'd be willing to maybe speak to some of the motivations. I think, especially in the US, we learn a lot about the kind of antebellum period, and we don't have a sense that people would necessarily be willing to work together, working class whites and enslaved Africans. We don't have a sense from the US education system that would be possible. So I was wondering if you could speak to some of what really motivated people to work together in ways that are surprising to some.
Yeah, and I think definitely, part of the wonderful part of becoming a revolutionary and learning more about actual people's history is finding out that actually people have worked together for a very long time and like to do that and are good at it. And if you read about people from the past that have done it, you can be better at it yourself today. And so a lot of the motivations that people had for working together are the same that we can have now, like the just desire for something better, and the knowledge that other places were trying these things. Like I mentioned, there was refugees from other revolutions that came to this country seeking something better, and people don't just resign themselves to thinking that that's all that can happen, because they saw that struggle helped advance things a certain way. And so a lot of like the Irish and the Germans from failed revolutions, they came and they still had their fighting spirit, and they still had that experience of fighting for something better, and decided to keep forwarding it. So that was a really wonderful thing. And there's places that have done it successfully, and I'm sure that some people knew about those in that time as well. So yeah, and like I mentioned, people who maybe before weren't so, their consciousness wasn't as raised as others who had these experiences directly. By talking to people and being around, a lot of these people who had experienced the effects of slavery and the effects of like abject poverty, they got to see that this absolutely wasn't correct, that it didn't need to happen, and that maybe even if you're not in a place to know exactly what it is that you can do that will result in a change, you know that it's just unacceptable and has to change. And that seems to be like the big motivation for a lot of why these people joined together and fought together and figured out a way for us to learn from them and be able to keep advancing that fight.
All right, thanks, comrades, for the exchange. We'll keep, I suppose what we'll do now is just save all the questions for the end, after we go through all the speakers and yada yada. So before I introduce the next speaker, as a member of the Party of Socialism and Liberation, I'd like to talk about the PSL and some of the ongoing struggles. The PSL is a revolutionary Marxist party that was on the ballot in 15 states in the November 3rd election. The PSL believes that the only solution to the deepening crisis of capitalism, racism, pandemics, and the environmental catastrophe is a socialist revolution that puts power in the hands of the working class so that we can eliminate exploitation and ensure everyone's basic needs are met. This cannot simply happen from the ballot box. The PSL is dedicated to militant organizing and international solidarity. It is this very organizing that has deemed such a threat to the pro-police status quo in Colorado that some of our members were arrested on ridiculous charges from a Democrat district attorney, Dave Young, who was the target of protests demanding justice for Elijah McClain, an African-American man who was murdered by the Aurora Police Department. 3 of these lead organizers, Eliza Lucero, Lillian House, and Joel Northam, potentially face decades in prison. Please go to pslweb.org to read the full story. All of which, there you will find a petition, a solidarity statement, and a donation page, all of which we would really appreciate your contributions towards. I will put the donation link in the chat soon. You can also donate via Venmo using the handle at Donate for Denver. I will also put the handle in the chat as well. Now, I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Farah Thompson. Farah is an LGBTQ activist who has contributed greatly to the local struggle of trans rights. A speaker in the 2019 San Diego Women's March, Farah has also spoken on multiple local and nationwide panels since the onset of the pandemic regarding topics such as the special oppression of Black trans women face under capitalism, the Attica prison rebellion, police brutality, and more. Please welcome Farah Thompson.
Hi. Yeah, I'm sorry for the delay there, but thank you for having me. So, Aranza gave some pretty good presentation regarding the history of resistance in America, mentioning figures like John Brown, and even the Buffalo Soldiers in the Civil War. But of course, we gotta talk about things as they are now. This past summer, we saw a great uprising with the George Floyd protest. And because of that particular kind of protest, it demanded a specific time of agenda. People were out there, almost spontaneously uprising, organizing, fighting the police, and so forth. But during and after all that, we need a comprehensive program that addresses not just the present needs, but also future needs and what it truly means to abolish the police. And so PSL San Diego, and other branches across the nation have these 12 points. You will list these 12 points in the chat room, but I want to summarize them for you, if only to give you some, thinking material. But also, if you want to join an organization, you can see that we are among the many organizations who has an actual agenda for dealing with the police. So there's an article on Liberation School called How Will the Police Be Abolished? A Marxist Perspective. And that's what I'm going to be reading from and summarizing. And there are 12 points on the US state and the necessity of revolution. So we want to first establish our agenda. First, the Party for Socialism and Liberation stands for the overthrow, dismantling, and complete replacement of the core institutions of the capitalist state, which are the special bodies of armed men, quote unquote, namely the police, prisons, military, and courts. Now, what does that mean? Well, that leads us to the second point where we have to lay out the scale of the prison system in the United States. So the second point, the centrality of these violent institutions in capitalist governance is reflected in their gargantuan scale. Combined, the state institutions far outpace any other part of the government spending. The sprawling U.S. prison system is the largest in the world, accounting for 25% of the world's prisoners, with only 5% of the world's population. Keep in mind that's a factoid that's also borrowed from the Ava DuVernay documentary 13th. You've probably seen it. It's probably still on Netflix right now. And it shares that very fact. And this particular point, it includes 1,833 state prisons, 110 federal prisons, 1,772 juvenile correctional facilities, 3,134 local jails, 218 immigration detention facilities, as well as military prisons, civil containment centers, state psychiatric hospitals, and other institutions. So within the second point, we had to lay out the huge scale of the prison system in the United States. This leads us to the third point. The vast and sophisticated network of organized violence and coercion exists to defend the private property interests and power of the capitalist class. It's not designed to maintain personal safety or to fight crime, as claimed by the media. It ensures stability through force and intimidation. It is specifically focused on putting down any challenges to the highly unequal and oppressive social order. Every poor working class person who's ever engaged in a serious struggle for even the most basic things immediately runs into the forces of law and the state. So people like to talk about the law and free market as if these two things are separate things. And as you'll see in these other points, there is a specific agenda behind policing to protect not civil rights, but property rights, which can run counter to even the most basic needs of the population. This leads us to our fourth point. Police and military power in North America were foundationally premised on racism and brutal class oppression, and pointing down the triple threats of armed resistance from the indigenous people, the rebellions of enslaved Africans in the restless mainly immigrant, working class of growing urban centers. So you hear these stories about the immigration from Europe, even immigration from Latin America. Well, all that has to be regulated. There have been many stories, even before, atrocities of immigrants being turned away, either because there's a quota for a specific ethnicity of which they did not belong to, or because of other factors. Some had to turn to what's called illegal immigration as a result. So it's not easy to just simply legally immigrate, contrary to what people like to say in arguments against right for illegal immigrants. Now, this is not a story of way back when. On the contrary, police operations in Black, Native, and Latino neighborhoods still follow the logic of an armed occupation force. The capitalists carried out the greatest expansion of policing, the military, and the prison system in the 1960s and 70s. And this was as a weapon against the growing challenges to the imperialist system from within and without. So this enters the story of people like George Jackson, who wrote the prison letters and in response to being imprisoned, despite the help and assistance of Angela Davis. George Jackson himself had experienced much oppression and mistreatment, and with the prison letters, he wrote a very personal confessional of his own dehumanization, along with what he hoped would be a blueprint for inspiration for revolt within prison systems, which did happen in his time and after his death, and since then there have been many changes to the prison system in response to these uprisings. So the next point is, the nature of the state cannot be transformed under capitalism. A revolution is required to in order to change these institutions. So abolishing the police does not mean simply reforming the police. There's a very structural interest for the prison system as they exist to exist and to expand. If we merely only ask for reforms, like say asking police officers to wear cameras, that's only going to diagnose the problem slightly. And as you probably know, in San Diego, local activist groups can tell you that just because police officers have cameras on them, that hasn't made them any more kind. We've seen over the past few months in downtown San Diego, for example, a few incidents, even involving police wearing cameras, which they would sometimes even turn off. So that's why we ask for a structural change. So this leads us to our sixth point, where there's a few controversies around abolishing the police. Well, why is that? So we have to unite with the sentiment of those who are demanding abolish the police. It's a rejection of the propaganda about a few bad apples and the notion that police solve crime. But we gotta do more just debunk myths about the police. We gotta lay out how the police will be abolished. The truth is that the state will not abolish its own frontline protectors. To do so will be the suicide for the ruling class. At most, the capitalist politicians will move around some funding and enforcement responsibilities to new or less hated agencies, or turn toward private mercenary forces. But the abuses, violence, and racism of the police derive from their social function in the system. Their behavior towards the people does not principally derive from the agencies by themselves, and that same behavior will be reproduced in any new armed institution, tasked with defending this vastly unequal and racist system of capitalism. So, again, going back to our prior points, it's not just simply a matter of passing a few new laws or asking police officers to wear more cameras on their badges or whatever. There has to be much deeper, more structural change in that. Now, this part is quite long. Like I said, I will link this in the chat room. But we gotta go over the second point. What does abolishing police look like under socialism? So, under socialism, the working class and the press gain power, abolish capitalist law, and create a new set of rights and laws. The new power creates its own public safety, penal and national security institutions from the ground up to enforce those laws, to defend its revolution, and to repress the violent exploiters who have been overthrown. The social roots of so much of what constitutes crime will be rapidly addressed. So, of course, we can't just be naive and say that, once we take away the police, things will be peaceful. Though, of course, as we all know, the police are a big part as to why life is so oppressive right now. There is a social motivation behind these crimes as we know them. Everything from robberies to the criminalization of homelessness to even situations within the home and community, like domestic violence. All these things have a social factor to them. And so if people ask the question of, well, without the police, what would we do about these kinds of problems? Well, that's a question that can only be dealt with in action. Obviously we can't have a hero rise up and, fix all of our problems. We don't have Superman. So that's why we have a movement. Now, this goes up to an eighth point. In the worker state, this goal is to shrink specialized police force over time to the point of the dissolution. Socialism is a transitional phase to communism. In under communism, there are no special bodies of oppression whatsoever. No police, no prisons, no military. Communism is our go. Now, we do have some differences with other people throughout the other left. We do work with anarchists, we work with local community centers, some of those organizations you may know of, but there can be differences in regards to how we achieve these ends. So, in the final analysis, the state is synonymous with force. It is a question of power. The state manages social antagonism to the benefit of the ruling class. And under socialism, the class struggle does not disappear overnight, because social classes and their vestiges do not disappear overnight. Rather, the working class becomes the ruling class. The practical problems of a massive social transformation will involve complicated challenges. The resistance of disposed classes and their hired guns, the enduring prevalence of bourgeois reactionary patterns of behavior, and so on. So a revolution does not proceed according to playbooks and formulas, but rather consists of developing new forms of struggle to overcome class society. It does not just consist of victories, but of setbacks, compromises, and retreats. So, yeah, there will be very hard work, much hard work to be done. And as you probably know in your own social community organizations, you have to do your own kind of homework as to how to manage a space, how to take care of each other without calling the police. Those kinds of responsibilities will still have to exist. But, of course, having no police on our backs would definitely help us a lot to try to consolidate things better. At least I believe so. And I'm sure you do too. Now, this leads to the ninth point. As far as what can be done in capitalism, all the promises to fundamentally transform the cops' relationship with their oppressed working class via reforms, reorganizations, technical and sensitivity trainings always end up selling an illusion. In particular, the state's approach to rebellions, worker strikes, insurrections, and revolutionary organizations will never be reformed because repression of these is the core function. With that said, we do support the fight for reforms while the current capitalist system exists. So I know that I talked about earlier about the ultimate futility of simply saying that the more surveillance that we put on police, the better that they will behave. But we do still fight for reforms nonetheless. There was a recent thing where we and other organizations, we organized a big call to the San Diego City Council, tell them to don't defund the police. And they did it anyway, but there was a lot of media coverage around that where, oh, well, thousands of people, if not tens of thousands of people are saying, no, this is not what we want. But the city council is still doing it. But, one step back, there will be another opportunity soon. And with these kinds of reform fights, with the criticisms that we have of their limitations, we don't believe that we have to just simply opt out of them because we're holier than thou. No, we do recognize the validity of these fights. So the fight for reforms and the fight for abolishing police are ultimately part of the same fight. So, of course, there's a huge list in this ninth point I just read off, including reforming the conditions within prisons, which are often horrible. Women prisoners in particular, cis women For example, they are not allowed to have basic things like tampons or pads, which can lead to devastating health problems for people within prisons. They often go hungry, given very little food. And that's just one example that local organizations like local anti-prison organizations have shared. There are many more horrifying stories in which, if there are any reforms proposed under these systems, we will gladly, as PSL, fight alongside you on these matters. But that's just, like I said, that's just one part out of a huge list I'm reading off of. So I do encourage you to read this whole thing in full. Now, the 10th point is that we support the demand of oppressed people for community control, insofar as it represents a progressive yearning for self-determination, a way to create police forces separate from their oppressive state. But it must also be acknowledged from historical experience that every scheme to put the police under civilian or community control with hiring and firing powers has never been even partially won and implemented in the United States. Won, any victories. Even under capitalism, there's only so much that a community police force can do. It's just one step towards a much larger goal. So while we do sympathize with these calls for community policing, we do have to understand that as long as there's poverty, as long as there's redlining of living districts, as long as they're defunding a public school at the expense of charter schools, community policing can only do so much to band-aid that particular kind of problem. And so we do encourage these initiatives while also asking for even larger and much more interconnected struggle with these things. I believe Barrio Logan locally has its own, force. Obviously, Oyonda Barrio is doing its thing out there. We definitely do support them. But I'm sure even they agree that they can't just do this all alone. Oyonda Barrio started out as a neighborhood protection program because no one else would stand up for them. And we at PSL, among other organizations, elect to say, well, you're not alone at all, which is why we work with them a lot. And hopefully after the pandemic is over, we'll continue to work with them. Now, the 11th point is where there's some controversy around there was a trend of people using a slogan called "Jail Killer Cops." That's one of the many slogans. So people sell jail killer cops as something that's a contradiction, since many people within the Abolishing Police movement are anti-carceralists. They do not want to subscribe to carceralist logic on this kind of thing. But we do have a kind of a counter argument to that, in that the jail killer cop slogan is merely an expression of a sentiment. Now, obviously, there can be limitations to express sentiments, as I expressed before at the beginning of this presentation. Organizations and movements have to be sustained on more than just spontaneous reactions to tragedies. And so when people say things like jail killer cops, what they're expressing is a desire for real justice. Police have been killing people for hundreds of years at this point, almost from the very foundation of this country. And so we've seen before how the law system can fail us. We've seen before how simply asking people to donate to bail funds, to even supporting court cases, they can only go so far. And if the most that we can get out of it is for jail cops to face the consequence of their actions, well, that's where jail killer cops comes in. Now, the last point of this is that the task of revolutionary politics and agitation is to link the most immediate demand with other slogans that deepen the movement's revolutionary orientation and advance the struggle to the next stage. We combine the slogan of jail racist killer cops with other slogans of this nature that highlight the present injustice as a symptom of a racist, capitalist, and imperialist system. So people do say different things, do say more than just jail killer cops. At different junctures, people had chanted, "Stop the war on Black America." The people united can stop racist police terror. Racism is a disease, revolution is a cure. The democratic demand for equal justice under the existing state must be linked to revolutionary struggles to overthrow, smash, and replace that state. So there is an energy within these spontaneous movements, for not just George Floyd, but also Breonna Taylor and other victims of police violence, that it can be violent. It can be very emotionally charged, but that doesn't mean that we should dismiss it out of hand. This is a very real response to what has been a long-standing issue for decades. And with all the spontaneity and all the problems that can arise with these kinds of movements, we ask that we try to approach these not from a paternalistic way, but from a very active standpoint of working with these people, with working with everyone who expresses these sentiments, and bringing them to a much more larger systemic understanding of these problems. With these understandings, we may be able to help to abolish the police. Thank you.
All right, Comrade Farah, those points were chef's kiss. That was really good. I like that. For class struggle is necessary for total abolition, because the U.S. capitalist class will never give up their armed enforcers without a fight. A better world is not only possible, but it is within reach. If you'd like to help Comrade Farah and other comrades in the Party for Socialism and Liberation, please consider making a donation via Cash App or Venmo by searching for the handle PSL San Diego. All lowercase, no punctuation or spaces. Any contribution is greatly appreciated. The San Diego Justice Center, PSL, Answer, and the Peace and Freedom Party's local political home also has a GoFundMe, Patreon, and Big Cartel online storefront, which I will link in the chat. The San Diego Justice Center is completely run by volunteers and no paid staff. So we rely on contributions from the community and to keep everything up and running. Excuse me. Anyone who becomes a sustainer at any Patreon tier this month will receive a Jail Killer Cops t-shirt in the mail. I'd like to once again thank Comrades Aranza and Farah as we open it up for the general discussion. Please use the raise hand feature if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. You can also enter questions in the chat and I will read them loud. So again, at this time, if anybody would like to ask a question or has any thoughts, concerns, please go ahead, write them down. Write them on down. All right. Comrade Farah, question. So these 12 points, where can we find these? Where can we find these points for some people who aren't affiliated with the PSL, Answer, or other local organizations?
Well, I have just now linked the 12 points in the chat, but in case you want to find them yourself and other materials, I do invite you to go to Liberation School, the website. In fact, the full URL, I believe, is liberationschool.org. And under Liberation School, there's more than just those 12 list of 12 points. There's also bits of what Aranza shared as far as a historical perspective around this. So I would encourage you to go to liberationschool.org to try to look up more material and to look at these 12 points specifically under how would the police be abolished. Because, we had to make these things almost on the fly. These kinds of movements were rising up, and obviously people were asking for our input and asking for other organizers' input. And I think these particular 12 points are very comprehensive. Of course, maybe you may have some different ideas or some disagreements. I do invite you to look at them and, draw your own conclusions. I don't claim to say that this is like perfect 12 points or that the fight has stopped here, and it won't, especially not even with Biden in office coming soon. But yeah, liberationschool.org is where you can find these 12 points.
Awesome. Thanks, comrade. So
we have Justine on stack.
Oh, perfect. All right, Justine, go for it. What is your question?
Thank you. So this is for both or either panelists. Recently, I learned for the very first time in my life, which I think definitely reaffirms Aranza's point about getting access to this information, about the link between slavery and the way that police departments currently exist. Could either of you expound upon the fact, like the link between slavery and the slave patrols and the police departments as we see them today?
Sure. I think one way that this link is really clear in the context, modern context, is in the role of like the prison guard in the prison system. The way that slave captains were hired to find enslaved folks who would try to run away from those horrible conditions. And the way that the current, prison system has a loophole that just allows slavery, and more often than not enslaves Black people and Latino people and Native people. The role of the prison guard is really like crystallizes that role, and historically is, it's the same system of if someone tries to run away from those horrible conditions, what happens? They get taken back and they're exploited horribly. So I think, and then certainly the logic that allowed for that to exist is still, certainly visible in today's society with, the various lynchings that are still happening, and the way that, the racist motivations for killings are just excused, and people don't really face any consequences for it. Perhaps the social consequences from like popular social movements, but certainly not from, courts of law. Really shows how that link is still definitely there, and that logic is still definitely permeating like the justice system in this country as we know it. But I don't know if Farah has other comments to make.
Yeah, and to go on what Aranza said in more detail, so it has been documented from almost the very beginning. Intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and even Frederick Douglass, the latter of whom has a direct experience of living in slavery and had to fight for his own freedom. They've seen up front the link with policing, with the institution of slavery. And so of course, obviously, the fight was not more than just men doing the kind of work. There was Sojourner Truth having to speak throughout the nation and working with abolitionists in her time. Along, of course, there's people like Harriet Tubman who worked on the Underground Railroad and had to face, not just police patrols, but also even the efforts of poor whites and less well-off whites to turn them into the slave patrols, if only for momentary gain. The institution of slavery is something that is so widespread and so deeply set that there are very few bits of safety, and even abolitionists face threats to their lives trying to fight with this. And it's a similar kind of, and it's this particular kind of thing where I say that, yeah, it's not so much that there's a link. I say they're pretty much one and the same. What we're seeing with the expansion of the prison systems. Many of our consumer goods are made by prison labor. Whole Foods had a whole controversy about its, supposedly organic, pure goat cheese rinds being produced using prison labor. And it took a uprising and like some outrage for them to stop doing that. That was like 2 years ago, I believe. But obviously there's going to be more, some which are even happening even across the border, even around the world. So I will say that there's all one big system that from the early efforts of Harriet Tubman to present activists today talk about, say, chocolate and who makes our chocolate in Africa, for instance. It's still with us, and it shows how interlinked these things are.
Awesome. Great great question. Great answer, comrades. Is anyone else on So correct me if I'm wrong, comrades, while I read this question off, but has it already been answered? Given that Biden and Harris want to give more money to the police, do you think it is important to organize independently of the Democratic Party-based organization?
I'd say absolutely. Yeah, I might answer the question first. Yeah, I would say absolutely, because, like, of course, getting Trump out of office, people are saying that, well, I guess we can relax a little bit more. And at first, yeah, it may definitely seem that way. What we see at the prison system has definitely accelerated under Trump, with him, like, ramping up immigration restrictions, along with increasing the cruelty of the immigration system, as we've seen with the many leaks, from forthright settlements on immigrant women at the ICE concentration camps to initial things like the Muslim ban. But there are, in some ways, which we had to try to look out for continuations of these particular systems under the new administration. And so, yeah, I would say that absolutely, even with a change in the office, whatever happens in January 21st, I think we do still need to do community organizing. We do still need to be out there in the streets. And these kinds of immigration systems that we're dealing with right now aren't just going to just evaporate overnight once Biden gets in the office. That would be naive. So we got Trump out of office, but we have to hunker down and do even more work.
Yeah, well said. I think certainly I don't feel more hopeful with just the fact that, I guess Trump was more loud about being horrible. I think Biden's also been pretty loud about being super horrible with his history of racist policies that he's passed and the wording that he's used to help pass these policies, his, absolutely imperialist line and views of the world in regards to war. He was vice president when Obama deported the most people of any other president. And he also said that nothing is going to fundamentally change. So I don't feel safer just because Biden, said that cops should shoot protesters in the legs or whatever. I think that, and with Harris's track record, I certainly don't feel safe. Like they're gonna fix it all or handle it better. I think a lot of people are glad that there is a Black and Indian woman in office, and I think that is certainly something that is something to consider. But as a cop and as someone who put so many poor Black women in jail for absolutely ridiculous reasons, I think we definitely need more of a democratic, because I don't feel like we live in a real democracy, a more democratic world where people and workers are able to actually make these decisions and not just like rich Democrats in office who have already told us and shown us that they don't actually care about our interests, and especially in regards to police. And Biden, who has structured a lot of like the criminal justice system as we know it today, and some of the worst aspects of it.
Awesome. Thanks for the answer, comrades. We do have one more question, and it's from Comrade Michaela. So she wants to step up to the plate and ask the question. Excuse me. Oh, it's written. Pardon me. So Fred Hampton was murdered 51 years ago today. If you know about it, can you talk about the Rainbow Coalition?
Well, I can speak broadly that the Rainbow Coalition was an attempt by the Black Panthers to, Hampton himself said things like, we're not going to fight capitalism with Black capitalism, they're going to fight with socialism. And on that particular kind of line, the Rainbow Coalition was founded as a way to try to do some outreach to other communities. So they were trying to reach out to Latino working class communities along with white working class communities. But within the Black Panthers, there was also a bit of disagreement on what to call the lumpen proletariat. In other words, people who are unemployed, which, I can kind of relate to that. I'm still looking for work even on this particular kind of pandemic. And there's a question of well, the working class struggle, yes, but what about the many people who are left out of employment even today? What about the people who can't get work because of, again, they were arrested for trumped up drug charges, for possession of marijuana, among other things. And so even under a time, the Black Panthers had to deal with this question of the lumpen proletariat, people left out of employment. And the Rainbow Coalition was just one way of them trying to branch out. That would help to inspire other efforts like the Young Lords in New York. The Young Lords being an organization formed by Puerto Rican lumpen proletariat and working class immigrants in New York, and the particular struggles they face as Latinos against racism.
Great answer, comrade. Yeah. Rest in power to Fred Hampton. That, his impact is even still felt today within our movement and many other movements. And I think it's important to definitely look back and see what worked with the Black Panther Party and the Rainbow Coalition, what didn't, so that, we can refine it and make sure that we are, more of a sharpened spear when it comes to bringing the people together. We did have another question, and I think we do have a little more time, so I'll just start, seeing if anybody wants to ask questions. I'll still leave a little bit of time for people that want to ask questions. But the next question, comrades, comes from Emily. Do either panelists have a comment on Obama's comment on the snappy slogan that loses people, aka defund the police? Is it all right if I give a little more context to the question, comrades, or do you know enough about the situation to answer on it?
Yeah, I think if I may say something first, I've definitely heard of that particular kind of question.
Go for it,
or
comrade.
Statement. I've heard that statement first of all. This idea that defund the police loses because it's not like either it's some sort of alienating statement, and which is demonstrably untrue. We've seen the polls of approval for defunding the police and even abolishing the police increasing over the summer. Now, so first of all, that's demonstrably untrue that defunding the police is an alienating thing. But what this is a form of damage control of what they see as an encroachment by the left and the major party, the major Democratic Party, basically blaming statements like defunding police on the loss of some crucial House seats, which may impact Biden's ability to even pass even the most reformist kind of measures. But they're blaming things on people like, AOC, like the radical protesters on the streets, for somehow alienating people away from the left into the right. Which, again, that's how can you say that with the polls demonstrating otherwise, that there is broad support? But what this is just a series of rhetoric that we will have to fight against, a series of distortion we have to fight against, because people do clearly see for themselves, just how detrimental the police is, even to the ideas of community safety that decades of propaganda since the Reagan administration has told us is beneficial for our communities. And so I think I will say that, yeah, Obama's statement, that kind of thing, is yet another chapter of that kind of distortion that we will have to actively fight against.
Yeah, well said. Certainly agree with you. Yeah, and of course, Obama would say that for someone who works so hard to uphold the status quo, where the capitalist, economic order, where cops are protecting private property, where he sent cops out to brutalize Standing Rock protesters, or, you know, someone with a track record who isn't really standing up for the interests of the people in regards to the way that we structure police in this country. I think that it's showing, you know, Mao's comment about how someone who's frightened is going to, you know, speak louder about the issues that they're talking about. I think the reason that he brought it up is because defund the police is such an effective thing to push for, and it's an effective way to begin this process of abolishing the police. And so I think the fact that Obama's saying that we shouldn't do it is a sign that we absolutely should keep doing it. So good, you know, good. They're scared. Like I said, you know, capitalists are scared when we band together over common goals this way. So it just shows that we're doing all right. We're doing well in that respect. So yeah, that's what I feel.
Great answers, comrades. Keep the fire on the feet of the liberals trying to co-opt our movements. Let's see. We do have a couple questions. We got them starting to roll in. So let me try and read this one real quick. So moving forward, what are ways either of you here would think to position these ideas so as to present them to the average American, who is going to be very individually minded, and the idea or concept of communal involvement would be somewhat unfathomable to them, / a concept they would be highly resistant to?
I mean, I think we're seeing it already in regards to outreach by people within communities. You know, sometimes desperate situations are what drives people out of atomization and individual living spaces. I think that's one part of it. Maintain that, obviously, is like, you know, part of like what was trying to communicate in the 12 points that I've summarized. But I think I will say that one way to help, you know, reach out to people is to give them real material support. You know, people can't live on, you know, revolutionary rhetoric alone. You will have to, you know, put your money where your mouth is and try to prove to them that you're going to actually help them out. But also this calls into questions that I would ask about, like how an organization is, you know, formulated, or how a space is formulated to make sure that the most marginalized within it isn't left on the sides. You know, we can say that we're centering the most marginalized or reach out to individualized people. But, you know, like I said, not just material support we gotta give them. We also gotta give them like support, give them ways to contribute as well. And I think that will like help make people feel that this wider movement is for them. So that's my answer to that.
Yeah, well said. I think certainly pointing towards like the community projects that we've been involved in and other organizations have helped plan helps a lot of people see that this is super possible and isn't like a far lofty idea, but something that's immediate and possible. I think honestly, like the principle that the contradictions of capitalism are just going to get so intense that they're not going to be able to be ignored anymore is really coming to a head. I think, I don't know, I don't know about y'all. I don't talk to super rich people constantly every day. So I talk to mainly the people around me who are, you know, working class folks who know that they don't have access to healthcare and know that the police aren't there. You know, when someone pulls them over, they don't feel safe, or when they have to call the police, they don't feel better about it. They feel worse. They know that, you know, their kids are going to schools where they're not really being treated super well, where teachers are underpaid, where there's no access to, students are in debt for trying to learn things. It absolutely makes no sense that Bezos is set up to be a trillionaire, and yet there's people dying on the street every day for no reason with empty homes. I think all these things are just like very immediate things that people can just acknowledge and know. And then the way that these things are upheld in a capitalist system is through a series of lies and it's like inefficiencies which are planned, and then lies that prop those inefficiencies up. And I think once you start pushing at those lies and those inefficiencies, it clearly becomes, you know, apparent to people that this is like not the, like they know what budgeting is. You know, working class people know that they have to budget for things to work, or else you are on the street and you die. And so when you pose it that way, I think it's just simple budgeting. Like we shouldn't have ultra rich people who are never going to even touch the money that they have hoarding wealth when there's people dying on the street for absolutely no reason. That's like not a way to structure society. So I think in the end, there's like very like common sense arguments that once you start prodding and helping people understand that it's safe to think that things can be better, I think a lot of people are afraid of hoping for a better thing after they've been crushed so many times. The morale is really low. But I think once you tell them, you know, it's okay to hope for something better, and people historically have done it and succeeded, and you know, why can't we just budget for life to be good and not horrible and violent? Like that makes no sense. So that'd be my answer.
All right. Next question is coming from Karushi. Karoshi had his hand up earlier. He took it down, but if he wants to ask his question, he has the floor to do so.
Hey, thank you. This question is for either panelist. And my question has to do with like the whole class character of the state. And we kind of mentioned that as we talked about abolition and like revolutionary socialism. And I was wondering like how that fits into like a socialist country like Cuba, for instance, that had a revolution which kind of gave equality to Black Cubans. And well, like they still have a socialist state. They weren't able to abolish their police. They just have like socialist police with a different class character. So I was wondering if you can expand on like what revolutionary socialism kind of looks like in terms of like abolishing the current policing system we have, the different like racial relations.
Yeah, I can go ahead and comment on that. I think, you know, Lenin puts it really well when he explains that the state is sort of a structure that is in place to, and Farah talked about this as well, to sort of mediate all of the like class antagonisms that aren't gone yet. Socialism is it's a transition phase. All of the class antagonisms haven't been done away with yet, and the, you know, issues of class struggle hasn't completely been eliminated. We're in the process of doing that in socialism, and so the police have a very different role in Cuba because the people in power that structure what they're allowed to do and what they have to protect and the laws that are in place, because everyone has to be allowed healthcare, and if you're denied healthcare, that's not correct. Things like that, or if you're assaulted or someone says something incredibly racist or harasses you on a bus, like you can call the cops and they'll actually, their role, because regular working class people are in power, is to protect you and working class interests. So I think Lori, you also mentioned that police officers in Cuba don't really carry guns because that, you know, that's not their role. The role is to help people out, do things that working class people need to be done. So I think in our revolutionary social society, working class people have the power to decide how the community is going to be structured and how policing works until we, like Farah said, you know, come up with a way where eventually that'll dwindle down to communism where there is none of that, no need for that because there is no class struggle. Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, I want to say that I'm glad that you mentioned the example of Cuba, simply because I believe one of the books that PSO had published, Gloria Riva, has detailed her very own journeys within Cuba, and she has a first-hand account of how the police in Cuba, you know, generally behave towards the citizens, you know, contra the behavior of the police in the United States. Now, obviously, as Ronza said, this is a developing relationship, and even with these kinds of developments, there are still struggles, like with acceptance of LGBTQ individuals and with Black people, even in Cuban society, which they have since made strides with. But within Cuba, they had to deal with some, you know, inertia from from centuries of colonialism. Cuba has been a colonized nation, and its police state is inherited from that colonization. Same case in Venezuela, same case even in Bolivia, and Bolivia has its own contemporary struggles. But these struggles do like give like a glimpse of what that would look like under a communist socialist society, where police is working with our neighbors instead of rather being its very own agenda set against the community. one of the main sources of alienation is the alienation of what we deem to be our community watchers from the very people who live within these communities. And these can engender distrust of our neighbors, distrust even of visitors, and so forth. Removing that kind of alienation obviously is a very piecemeal project, and Latin America has been trying to fix that. It's no wonder that their governments are constantly being couped by the United States. It has happened to Brazil, unfortunately, with Bolsonaro currently carrying forth a U.S. Agenda to a point of destroying its very own Amazon and destroying other rainforests. And we're seeing that now with opposition of socialist leaders and the rest of Latin America because of their addressing deeply rooted colonial issues.
All right. Thanks for the answers, comrades. Let me just check to see if there's anybody else on stack or has questions. It doesn't look like it. So, quick notes before we wrap this up. Next month, we are doing, we are having a forum similar to this on Cuba on January 1st or New Year's Day. So if you do have some time, which I mean, it's a holiday, so everybody has a little time to just, check their phones or their computers, you should definitely check out our forum on Cuba. Also, to caveat off of that, I do believe that former presidential candidate Gloria Riva will be at this next forum. So she will be at our next monthly forum. So if anybody wants to hop on, check that out, and see what Comrade Gloria has to say. She is speaking. See what she has to say on the subject of Cuba and our liberation and struggle here in the U.S. Definitely, please come check it out. So thank you all for joining us at this for Answer at San Diego's inaugural forum in our new monthly series. I'm going to put the PSL's the PSL San Diego's link tree in the chat in case anyone would like to sign up for updates, follow us on social media, or help support the socialist cause. So please join us New Year's Day, January 1st, for a fruitful discussion about the Cuban Revolution and the need to end the genocidal blockade that is being enforced by the United States. Until then, we must all keep our eyes on Venezuela as they host parliamentary elections for their National Assembly December 6th. Side note to their National Assembly, they have actually, disregard. I'll just do my thing. Our revolutionary love and solidarity is with the United Socialist Party of Venezuela and the Bolivian Revolution. Hope you all have a good night and stay safe, everyone.